The billy goat hit the Drumhollow depot yard like a thrown stone, all horn and panic, and for the space of 3 breaths, not one man in that crowd moved to stop it. It had broken loose from a slat crate on the morning freight, and now it tore down the length of the platform with its rope dragging, and its eyes rolled white, scattering a stack of egg cases into yellow ruin, splitting a barrel of nails so they rang across the boards like hail, sending the dry goods drummer up onto a baggage cart and the depot agent backward through his own office door. Men shouted, and nobody acted. They were quick enough with their boots when the thing came near and quick enough with their laughing afterward, but in the moment itself they stood back the way men do, each one waiting on the next. And it was a woman who walked into it, a big woman, broad through the shoulders and heavy through the hip and arm, a full hand taller than the depot agent's wife, the kind of woman the county had already looked over once and filed away under too much. Too much size, too much plain, too much of everything to be of any earthly use to anybody. She had stepped down off that same freight not 2 minutes before with a flour sack over her shoulder, and she set the sack down on the boards now, slow and certain, and she went toward the goat while every man in Drumhollow went the other way. Her name was Orpha Brand, and she was 28 years old, and she had been underestimated every single day she had been alive, and she had learned a long time ago to let the work answer for her instead of her mouth. So she did not shout, she did not grab. She came at the maddened animal low and sideways, her reddened milker's hands open and easy at her sides, and out of her came a sound that was hardly words at all, a low, even, churning hum down in the chest, the sound a person makes to a frightened beast in a dark barn at calving time. The goat wheeled to face her, hooves skidding, head down to hook. Orpha did not stop and did not hurry. She kept that low sound going, and she kept her gray eyes off the goat's eyes, the way you do, looking at its shoulder instead of its face. And she got within an arm's reach, and then she was past the horns, and her hand was flat and warm on the side of its neck. The animal shuddered the whole length of its body. It tried once to rear, and she rode the motion down with the heel of her hand, talking the entire time in that churning hum, and then the thing simply quit. It stood blowing, sides heaving, and let her gather the dragging rope into her fist and snub it short, and the wild went out of its eyes by degrees the way heat goes out of a horseshoe. The depot yard had gone dead quiet. 40 people had watched a fat milkwoman off the morning freight walk down a maddened goat with her bare hand and a sound in her throat, and not one of them had a thing to say about it yet. If this story moves you, do me a kindness and subscribe and follow all the way to the very end, and drop the name of your city down in the comments so I can see just how far Orpha's story travels tonight, because it travels a good long way before we're through. There was a job notice tacked to the depot wall, and that is what had carried Orpha 400 miles to stand in that ruined freight yard with a goat on a rope. She had read it off a torn-out scrap of Drumhollow newsprint that a tinker had left behind in a Dakota wayhouse, read it 3 times by lamp flame, and then folded it small and put it in her bodice next to nothing else, because nothing else was what she had. Halverson Place, Antler Bend Road, wants a woman of capable hands to milk and tend the goats and keep house, room and board. No references required. Those last 3 words were the ones that had set her on the road. No references required meant a man who needed the thing done badly enough not to ask where she came from or who would speak for her. And a man like that was a man who would take a woman the rest of the country sent away from the door. She had no family living. She had no letter from any preacher or any former mistress to put in a stranger's hand. She had her own 2 arms, which had milked and churned and pressed and salted since she was 9 years old, and she had the 1 flour sack. And in the flour sack she had her dead mother's dented copper churn and a worn wooden cheese hoop and press, the only 2 things in the whole turning world that were hers and nobody else's. A roof. A chance to earn her keep at the one labor she was sure of. That was the whole of what Orpha Brand wanted out of life as she stood snubbing that goat in the Drumhollow yard, and it was not a large want, and the county still meant to tell her it was more than she had any business asking for. The depot agent found his voice first, now that the danger was a thing safely held on a rope by somebody else. He came back out his office door, brushing his coat and looking at the wreck of his platform like it had insulted him personally. "That animal's off the Halverson consignment," he said, to no one and to everyone. Halverson had it shipped up from the Bitterroot, paid freight on it, and now, look. "Look at my eggs," a couple of the men laughed, the loose, easy laughter that comes when a fright has passed and somebody else has paid for it. The drummer climbed down off his baggage cart, and from the open doors of the depot warehouse a voice said, dry and unimpressed, "Tie it to the rail and leave it. I'll not chase it twice." Orpha turned at the sound. The man who had spoken stood half in shadow with a freight bill in his gloved hand, and she knew before anybody named him that this was the one whose newsprint she carried folded against her breastbone. He was tall and spare, and weathered to the color of saddle leather, somewhere past 40, with a close dark beard going iron at the jaw and eyes that had the particular flatness of a man who had stopped expecting anything good a while back and made his peace with the lack. He did not look at the goat with any wonder for how it had come to be standing quiet. He did not look at Orpha with any wonder either. He looked at her the way a man looks at a delivery that has come in heavier than he wrote down, a fact to be dealt with, nothing more. And Orpha felt the old familiar weather of that look settle over her, and she did not let it touch her face. She had been read off and put down by better and worse than this tired rancher, and the goat was still warm and quiet under her hand, and she knew exactly one thing in this town for certain, which was that she could do the work. "You'll be Halverson," she said. It was not a question, and she did not make it one. The man's flat eyes moved over her once, the whole broad height and weight of her, the work dress and the rolled sleeves and the reddened hands, and something crossed behind them that she had seen cross behind 100 faces and learned the meaning of young. He had hoped she would not come. He had tacked his notice and run it in the Drum Hollow paper and ridden in to the depot half, wishing the morning freight would bring him nobody at all, so he could say he tried, so he could go on to the next thing that was already decided in his mind. She could read it plain. He had not expected the woman who answered to be quite this much of a woman, and now that she stood in front of him solid as a churn, she was one more weight on a load he was already trying to set down. "Caleb Halverson," he said. He did not offer the gloved hand. He looked at the goat. "You did that quick." "It wasn't mad," Orpha said. "It was scared. There's a sight of difference, if you've the time to know it." She gathered the rope and her flour sack both into her two hands without making any show of the load. "I'm Orpha Brand. I've come about the place, about the goats, and the house. I know what you've come about." He said it without heat, the way he seemed to say everything, like words cost him out of a thin purse. He looked at her another moment, and she watched him do the sum he had ridden in to do. Watched him decide she would last a week. Watched him decide it did not signify much how long she lasted, because the place was going regardless, and she would only be milking a few worthless goats in the meantime, so a grieving man could clear off the worst of the chores and walk away clean from the wreck of it. None of that showed on the surface of him. What showed was a short nod toward a buckboard standing in the dust beyond the freight scale, a sorry-looking rig with one tired sorrel in the traces. "Wagon's there. Put the goat in back. Mind it doesn't go through the bed." That was the whole of her hiring. No how-do, no will-you suit, no testing of her hands or her churn. He turned and walked toward the rig and left her to load a half-wild goat and her own self and her one sack into the back of his wagon, and Orpha did it without a word of complaint, because complaint had never once in her life bought her a single thing she needed, while work had bought her everything she had. As she heaved the goat up and snubbed it short to the side rail, she heard the men by the depot wall start in. Low. Not quite low enough. "That the milkwoman?" "That's a deal of milkwoman." "Halverson's hard up, but Lord, he could have had 2 for the freight on that one." And the loose laughter again, and a woman's voice somewhere saying she'd not last to Sunday. Big as she was, she'd want feeding twice a day and do half a man's work. And what was Caleb thinking? Orpha did not turn her head. She settled the goat, she settled her sack with her mother's copper churn inside it, and she climbed up onto the seatboard beside the silent man. And the buckboard rocked under her weight, and he said nothing about that either, only clucked to the sorrel and put the depot and the laughing crowd behind them. The road out of Drum Hollow ran north along a willow brake creek with the cottonwoods just beginning to turn, and it was beautiful in a hard, cold way. The light coming long and gold across stubble fields, with the first frost not many mornings off. Neither of them spoke for the better part of an hour. Orpha did not mind silence. She had ridden out many a quiet mile in her time, and learned that the quiet of a man who has nothing to say is easier to bear than the chatter of one who only wants you to know your place. She watched the country instead, because the country would tell her the truth of where she was going faster than the man would. She saw fat dairy land going to seed for want of working, good bottom ground that should have been thick with milk stock and instead lay half empty, the fences down and the spring boxes dry. She saw a teamster pulled up at a gate with cans of milk gone gray and clabbered in the sun because there was nowhere worth the hauling to take them, and the man tipped them out in the ditch as the wagon passed. And Orpha watched good milk run to waste in the road and felt it in her like a small wrongness she could not name. She saw a fine creamery on the edge of town with fresh paint and a new scale house, a great beam scale standing in the open door of it, bright as a new coin. And she marked it, the only prosperous thing on a road of failing ones, the one well-fed building among the lean. She could not yet have said why it sat wrong with her, only that a country full of failing dairies and one fat creamery growing fat upon them was a sum that did not balance, and Orpha Brand had spent her whole life reading the things that did not balance, in a churn, in a beast, in a face. She tucked the look of that bright scale away in the back of her mind the way she tucked away anything she did not yet understand, knowing she would have the why of it sooner or later, because she always did. She saw, as they came up onto the Antler Bend Road at last, the Halverson place itself, and her heart did a thing it had no business doing, which was to lift. It should not have lifted. By any plain accounting, the spread was a ruin. The split-rail paddocks sagged and gapped where stock had pushed them, and nobody had mended them. The barn stood, but it stood tired, with a strip of roof shakes peeled back like a sore. Down the slope toward the creek there was a low stone building that must once have been the spring house and dairy, and half its roof had fallen in upon itself, so it sat in the willows with its back broken, and in the breaks beyond it Orpha could see them, the goats, 8 or 10 of them, gone half wild and ragged, browsing the brush with their bells long since lost. Beasts that had been somebody's careful little herd once, and were now just so much shaggy debt grazing toward nothing. A sour old milk cow stood apart at the fence, dry as a stick, watching the wagon with dull eyes. And on the porch of the gray unpainted house a small boy stood, maybe 7 years old, thin and still as a fence post, watching them come with a face that gave away not one thing. And Orpha understood, without being told, that this was the rest of what the newsprint had not said. A motherless boy, a dead wife's dairy gone to ruin, a debt riding the whole place like a second mortgage on the very air. Caleb Halverson drew the sorrel up in the yard and set the brake and sat a moment looking at none of it, the way a man looks past a thing he can no longer stand to look at, and then he stepped down and said the first full string of words he had offered her all day. Goats want milking morning and night. House wants seeing to. You'll have the little room off the kitchen and your board. I mean to be quit of this place by spring, so don't go making yourself comfortable in it. Then he walked to the boy and put one hand on the thin shoulder and steered him indoors, and the door shut, and Orpha Brand sat alone in the failing light of the Antler Bend Road with a half-wild goat at her back, her dead mother's copper churn in a flour sack at her feet, and the whole sagging ruin of the place spread out before her gold and broken in the dusk, and she looked at the caved-in spring-house down among the willows for a long, long while, and she did not see a ruin at all. She saw, the way she always saw, the work that wanted doing, and where she might begin. It had been 400 miles of hard road to bring her to that depot yard, and the whole of it had begun with a scrap of newsprint no bigger than her palm. Orpha had found it pinned to the wall of a hiring office 2 counties over, gone soft and gray at the folds from other hands that had read it and let it be, and she had read it 3 times before she let herself believe it was meant for someone like her. Halverson Place, Antler Bend Road, it said, wants a woman of capable hands to milk and tend the goats and keep house, room and board, no references required. That last line was the one she folded inward and kept against her heart, because she had no references and never had, no family to write a letter for her, no mistress to swear she was honest, no proof of herself anywhere in the world but the work itself and the 2 things she carried. She had stood in that office a long while, with the scrap in her reddened fingers. A woman the county she came from had already weighed and called too much of everything, broad through the shoulder and heavy through the hip, and a hand taller than the men who measured her. And she had thought, no references required. Somebody out west wanted only that the goats be milked. Goats she could milk. A house she could keep. The rest of what people thought of her she had, long since, learned to set down and carry separate from the work, the way you carry a full pail without letting it slop. She bought her passage with nearly the last of her coin, and rode the cars and then the jolting stage until the green country gave way to the Dun and Amber Montana flat, and the whole way her flour sack sat on her lap and not in the rack overhead, because inside it, wrapped in her one spare apron, were her dead mother's dented copper churn and the worn wooden cheese hoop, and those she would not let out of her own 2 hands for any comfort in the world. So she had come, and gentled the maddened Billy in the freight yard before she had so much as said her name. And now she sat on the high seat of the Halverson wagon, with the dust of Drum Hollow falling behind her, and the silent man beside her, giving the team its head down the Antler Bend Road. Caleb Halverson had not thanked her for the goat. He had looked at her there in the wreck of the depot, crates the way a man looks at a tool that has turned out to be heavier than he reckoned, neither pleased nor sorry, only taking the new weight of it, and he had said, "You'll be the milk-woman," then in a voice with no question left in it. She had said she would. He had looked once more at the breadth of her, at the strong reddened hands folded over the flour sack, and something had crossed behind his eyes and gone, shut away, before she could read it, and he had only jerked his chin at the wagon and said, "Climb up. It's a piece out." That was the sum of their acquaintance. He was a lean, weathered man somewhere past 30, brown as the road, with a grief worn so deep into him it had stopped looking like grief and started looking like stone, and he drove with his hat low and his eyes on the team's ears and said nothing for the better part of an hour, and Orpha, who had learned long ago that a body could not shame you with silence unless you let it, said nothing either and watched the country. It was hard, handsome country going to ruin. She saw the cattle thin on the bunch grass, fewer than a spread that size ought to run. She saw fenced down in 3 places and not mended. She saw the willow breaks along the coulee where pale shapes moved that she knew for goats before they were near enough to call goats, half-wild things gone shaggy and shy, scattering up the cut-bank at the sound of the wheels. She counted what she could of them as they fled, 8, 9, a dozen, more in the brush she could not number, their coats matted with last winter's burrs, their udders gone half-dry and ragged from a year of nobody's hand, and one old soured milk cow standing apart in the trampled mud of a dry lot, bony and slack-bagged, lowing once at the wagon and then giving it up. A body that did not know goats would have seen only vermin gone wild and let them go. But Orpha had milked since before she could read, and her pale gray eyes went over those fleeing pale shapes the way another woman's might go over a length of good cloth, and she saw past the burrs and the wildness to the deep-chested, sound-legged dairy stock underneath, beasts that had been somebody's pride once and could be milk again under a patient hand. she said nothing of it. She only marked where they watered and where they bedded, and let the country teach her while the man drove and brooded. And then the wagon came over a low rise, and the Halverson place lay below in the slanting afternoon light, and Orpha looked at it and did not let her face change, but her heart went down in her like a stone in a well. The house was sound enough, a low log and frame thing with a good roof, but it had the shut, curtain-drawn, unswept look of a place where a woman had died and nobody had had the heart to keep it after. The barn sagged at one corner. And the spring house, she found it with her eye at once, the way you find the one thing you have come 400 miles for. The spring house down by the cold seep below the house had caved clean in. The stone walls slumped inward over a black ruin of fallen turf and rotted shelving. A cold, clear thread of water still running out of it pointlessly into the trampled mud, running and running with nothing left to keep cold. That was the dairy. That was the place her newsprint scrap had promised. It had been dead a year if it had been dead a day. Caleb drew up in the yard, and a lame old man came out of the barn to take the team, and that was Asa Dunmore, gray and grizzled and bent at the hip, so he walked with a long dipping hitch, and he looked up at Orpha on the high seat, and she watched his weathered face do the arithmetic the world always did. He looked at the size of her, and his lip curled back off a brown tooth, and he said, "Not low enough, not meaning it low enough. This the milkwoman, Caleb? Hired us a whole milkwoman and a half, looks like." He gave a dry, barking sound that was not quite a laugh, and spat to the side, and took the headstall. And to the near horse, "Conversational," he said, "She'll not last out the week, and to Caleb, she'll quit by Sunday. You mark it, I'll lay you $1 on it, she's gone by Sunday." Caleb did not answer him. Caleb was already climbing down. Orpha gathered her flour sack against her and got down off the wheel on the far side, slow and certain, the way she did everything, and she felt the old man's eyes on the breadth of her back, and she did not turn around. She had been laughed at by better men than Asa Dunmore, and outlasted every one of them. She set the sack down careful on the porch boards, and she said, civil and plain, "Where do you want me to start?" Caleb told her, and the telling was the whole of what he was. Milk the goats, what she could catch of them, get milk for the house and the boy. Tidy the place up, the house and the yard, make it look kept. There was a room off the kitchen, his late wife's sewing room, she could have. Board she'd take with them. As for wages, he stopped on the word as though it tasted of something. As for wages, they'd settle that by and by when he saw what her work was worth, and there was a thing she should know going in. Said flat, looking off at the thin cattle and not at her, so there'd be no false hopes in it. He didn't mean to keep the place. He meant to sell. There was a note on the land, the bank's note, come due in the fall, and a creamery man in town with money who'd buy the whole spread, stock and all, and Caleb meant to let it go and take the boy somewhere a man could start clean. He only wanted it milked and tidy and looking like something in the meantime, so the goats didn't all die feral and the buyer didn't dock him for a ruin. That was the work. That was all the work was. Did she understand him? Orpha looked at the caved spring house and the cold water running out of it to no purpose, and then she looked back at him and said that she understood him fine, and something in the steady gray of her eyes made him glance away first, though neither of them remarked it. So that was the bargain, and it was a poor and a closing-down bargain, and the cruelty of the place was not in Caleb's flat voice, but everywhere around it, and it found her mouth to mouth all that first afternoon. When she went down to look at the goats, 3 riders from a neighboring outfit were watering at the coulee, and they sat their horses and watched her come, watched the whole heavy, capable length of her come down through the willow brakes. And one said to another, low and grinning, "Halverson's gone and hired the fat milkwoman. You see the size of her." And the other said there'd be nothing left for the goats was she let near the pail, and they laughed the easy laugh of men who have never in their lives had to be of any use to anybody, and rode off. When she went up to the house to see what keeping it would take, she heard Asa in the barn telling Caleb again, low, that no woman built like a feed sack was going to chase down range goats in the willows, that he'd seen her kind before, all sit and no go, and Caleb had said nothing back, which was its own kind of agreement. The town had said it too. She'd heard it pass already in the depot. Halverson hired the fat milkwoman from off the cars. No references, no people, won't last, as though her body were a wager the whole of Drumhollow had already laid its money against, and she let it all wash over her and through her and out, the way the cold seep washed through the ruined spring-house, because not one of them had set a hand to a teat or a churn dasher in their lives. And she had, and the work would answer them. It always had. She had only to live long enough at it. The worst of the broken things was not the spring-house and was not the note. The worst of the broken things was the boy. She first saw Tobias where the yard met the goat pen, a small, slight child of about 7, crouched in the lee of the rail with his arms around his knees, watching the willows where the feral nannies showed and hid. He had his father's brown coloring and a face gone too still for a child's, the particular stillness of a young thing that has learned the house holds no comfort and has stopped going to it. Toby, his father had called him once, the whole afternoon, and the boy had come and stood near and not answered. He had no mother, that much was plain in everything, in the unswept house and the dead dairy, and the way the man and the boy moved past each other like two stones in the same creek. And he watched Orpha with a flat wariness that was worse than fear, the look of a child taking her measure to learn how soon she too would be gone. When she crouched at the rail near him, slow so as not to startle, and said her name was Orpha, and asked him his, he did not give it. He looked at her a long moment with his father's shut eyes, and then he looked back at the goats, and that was all. She did not press him. She had been a child nobody wanted herself, and she knew better than anybody alive that you do not reach for such a child with your hands. You reach with the work, and you let the work be slow, and you let the child come to it in his own time or not at all. She would milk the goats where he could see. That would be the start of it, if there was to be a start. The light went down gold and then gray, and supper was a cold and silent business at the scrub table, Caleb at the head not eating much, and Toby beside him eating less, and Asa wolfing his and watching her over it with his bright old scornful eye. And after, while the dishes soaked, Orpha took up her flour sack and a stub of candle, and went down alone through the cold falling dusk to the ruined spring-house, because she had to see it whole before she could begin, and because what she meant to do where no one would watch her do it. The cold of the seep came up through her boots. She set the candle on a slumped stone and looked at the ruin of it in the small light, the caved turf roof, the rotted shelves. The good clean water still running out of the stone trough in the floor as it had run before any Halverson ever came. Water cold, and steady enough to keep a cheese sound through a Montana summer. Water that did not know the dairy above it was dead. The stone walls stood yet under the fallen roof. The trough was sound. The bones of it were good. A body with strong hands and a year of will could raise that roof and scour those shelves and set that cold water to work again. And a body with strong hands was the one thing Orpha Brand had brought 400 miles, and the one thing the whole of Drumhollow had bet there was nothing else to her but. She knelt in the cold and the mud in her faded blue dress, and she opened the flour sack, and she took out, unwrapped from her one spare apron, the dented copper churn that had been her mother's and her mother's before her, the only inheritance she had in the world, and she found the one stone shelf that still stood level along the standing wall, and she wiped it clean with the heel of her hand, and she set the copper churn upon it. It caught the candlelight, dull and warm in all that ruin, the one made thing in a place gone back to wreck. She set the wooden cheese hoop beside it, and kneeling there in the cold with her dead mother's churn on the stone shelf of another dead woman's dairy, she made the place a promise, not aloud, because Orpha was not a woman who spent her words where her hands would do, that she would not quit by Sunday nor by any Sunday after, that she would bring this cold dead room back to a humming life, that whatever the man meant to sell and whatever the town meant to laugh at, She had come here to stay, and she would let the work say so. Then she pinched out the candle and climbed up through the dark to the unkept house, and in the gray of the next morning, before the man or the boy or the old hand was stirring, she took a clean pail down to the willow brakes to begin. Morning came gray and clean over Antler Bend, and Orpha Brand was already in the willow brakes before the frost had burned off the rails. She did not go at the goats all at once. She had learned, long ago and the hard way, that a frightened beast cannot be reasoned into trust any faster than a frightened person can, and that the only thing patience cost was time, which was the one thing she had plenty of and no one had thought to take from her. So she carried a low stool and a battered pail down to the edge of the brake where the willows leaned over the creek, and she sat. She did not call to them. She did not chase. She broke a heel of barley bread into her broad red palm and held it out and waited, and she hummed, low in her chest, the toneless milking sound her mother had hummed to a cow 40 years gone, a sound with no words in it that meant nothing but that the world was steady and no harm was coming. The goats watched her from the brush with their strange slatted eyes, and the old buck stamped, and the does shifted and would not come, and Orpha sat until her hip ached on the stool, and her breath fogged and faded and fogged again, and she let them look their fill. She had been looked at her whole life. She knew how to be looked at and stay easy in her skin while it happened. By the second morning one doe, a rangy gray-flanked thing with a torn ear and an udder gone hard and lopsided from going unmilked, came close enough to take the bread, snatching it and bolting, and Orpha did not move a muscle, only hummed and counted it the best wage she had earned in a year. She named them as she learned them, because a thing with a name is a thing you are bound to, and she meant to be bound. The gray doe with the torn ear she called Patience, for the lesson of her. There was a black and white one, heavy and slow and dignified, that she called Deacon's wife for the prim way she stepped over puddles. A flighty young one, all legs and nerves, she called Sparrow. A stubborn cream-colored matron with a beard like an old man and an udder still full and aching that she called Goldie. And Goldie, it turned out, was the queen of the herd, and the morning Goldie let Orpha lay a hand on her flank and lean a shoulder into her and ease the first hard, hot stream of milk hissing into the pail. The whole herd seemed to let out a breath at once and come a half-step nearer. The milk that nobody in Drum Hollow believed those feral beasts still held came down sweet and rich and faintly grassy, foaming pale at the top of the pail, and Orpha sat back on her heels in the cold and looked at it a long moment the way another woman might look at a chest of coin. She milked them out gently, never to the last, never hurrying, easing the bagged and aching ones first so the pressure that had soured their tempers drained away, and within 4 days the kicking and the bolting had gone out of them, and they lined up of their own accord along the split rail, jostling and complaining and shoving their heads at her apron. And the old buck stood off and watched and stamped and pretended he had nothing to do with any of it. The spring house was next, and it was the harder labor. It had caved at the north corner where a roof beam had let go, and the stone had slumped after it, and the floor was a slick of old leaves and creek silt and the bones of small drowned things, and the shelves where a dead woman had once set her crocks were green and furred with rot. Orpha hauled out the wreck of it by the armload, broad back bending and straightening, her sleeves shoved past the elbow and her wheat-brown hair coming loose strand by strand to stick to her sweated neck. She found the spring still ran true under the floor, cold and steady out of the hill, which was the whole reason the building stood where it stood, and she cleared the channel of it with her bare hands until the water ran clear over her wrists and ached the bones of them. She scalded the stone shelves with kettle after kettle of boiling water hauled up from the kitchen fire, and scrubbed them with sand and lye until the green was gone and the stone showed gray and clean. And she set the cracked beam right with a fence post Asa would not admit to having left leaned just so against the wall where she would find it. By the end of the week the spring house smelled of wet stone and cold water and lye soap instead of rot, and her mother's dented copper churn stood on the scoured shelf where she had set it that first dusk as a vow, and now the vow had a place that was clean enough to keep it. She made butter first, because butter was quick and butter was proof. She skimmed the cream off the cooling pans, set it to ripen overnight in the cold of the springhouse, and worked the copper churn in the gray of the next morning, the dasher rising and falling under her strong reddened hands in the old rhythm, the slosh going thick and then sudden and grainy as the butter broke. She washed it and salted it and worked it on a wooden paddle until the buttermilk ran clear, and patted it up golden into a crock, and it was so far beyond the pale, greasy stuff the Halverson place had known since the wife died that it might have been a different food entirely. Then she made a soft, fresh cheese, the simplest thing, milk soured and warmed, and the curd cut and hung in a square of clean cloth from the springhouse beam to drip clear way through the night, and in the morning a round white cake of it sat on a board, faintly sweet, faintly tart, and she tasted it and knew her hands had not forgotten anything her mother put into them. The boy thawed first. She had marked him for it, the silent, motherless one, Toby, 7 years old and all elbows and watchfulness, who would not speak to her and would not come to the table without his father's hand on his shoulder steering him there. But the kid goats undid him. 2 of the does had freshened late, and there were 3 kids in the herd, leggy and absurd, and they took to bouncing sideways off the woodpile and head-butting the air at nothing, and Orpha caught the boy one cold morning crouched at the paddock rail with his whole still face cracked open in spite of himself, watching them. She said nothing. She did not look at him straight. She only went to the smallest kid, a brown one with a white blaze, and lifted it and set it down again near the boy's boots, and went back to her milking and let the thing happen on its own. By noon the kid was following Toby, and Toby was following the kid, and by the 3rd day the boy had a name for it. Biscuit, he said low when she asked, the first word he had given her unbidden, and after that he was at the pens whenever his chores let him, her silent shadow, handing her the rag, holding the pail, watching her hands the way a person watches who has decided, without saying so, to learn. Asa was the harder nut, and Orpha had known he would be. The old hand was lame in the off leg and bitter in the mouth, and he had bet aloud the first day that the fat milkwoman would quit by Sunday, and he had said it where she could hear, which she counted no cruelty, only an old man defending the last thing he owned, which was his low opinion of a changing world. She left him to it. She did not argue, and she did not perform. She only set a fresh crock of the gold butter and a wedge of the soft cheese and a hard heel of bread on the bench by the barn door where he ate his noon, and walked off and did not watch him eat it. She did this 3 days running and said not a word about it, and on the 3rd day she heard him behind her in the paddock, and turned, and found him glaring at the broken rail of the goat pen as though it had insulted his mother. In 20 years, he said, to the rail and not to her, his jaw working, I never had butter off this place a man could stand to eat. Not off the wife, God keep her, not off any hired girl. He spat. He hitched up the rail with his good shoulder and drove a fresh nail into it, lame leg braced, and drove another, mending the thing she had not asked him to mend, and when it was done he stood and looked at the goats lined up clean and easy along the fixed rail, and said, gruff as gravel, they're milking. It was not praise. From Asa Dunmore it was the deed to a kingdom, and Orpha knew it and gave him no more than a nod, because a man like that you do not thank out loud or you spoil it. After that the wood she needed was always cut. The pen latch that stuck got planed. He never said a soft word to her again in his life, and never needed to. Into town she went on a Saturday with the eggs and the first surplus butter, driving the old wagon Asa had grudgingly greased, and she found Drum Hollow much as the depot had promised. A clutch of false-fronted buildings strung along a muddy street, a depot, a creamery with Quill and Co. lettered gold on its window, a church, a bank with a brass-handled door, and the general store with Hattie Sells, prop painted plain above it. Hattie Sells herself was a small, brisk, gray-haired woman with quick hands and a quicker eye. And where the rest of the town had met Orpha with the sidelong look and the dropped voice and the laugh half swallowed behind a hand, Hattie met her square. She took the butter, weighed it honest on her own counter scale, named a fair price without being haggled to it, and looked Orpha full in the face while she did it. "Halverson's goats," she said, not a question, wrapping coins in paper. Folks said those goats was gone wild for good. She studied the gold of the butter through the cloth. Folks say a lot. She told Orpha which days the depot freight ran and which the creamery took milk, who would deal fair and who would skin you. Where the good water was and where the road washed out, the whole lay of the place handed over plain and free in the space of buying a sack of salt and a paper of needles. And when Orpha climbed back up to the wagon seat, Hattie stood in her doorway with her arms folded, and said, "You come in regular, now," which from a town that had bet against her was the second deed to a second kingdom, and Orpha drove home with two of them in her apron and the cold sun on her shoulders. And Caleb watched. From the barn door, from the corral fence, from the kitchen window at dusk, the stoic widower watched the fat milkwoman he had hired to tidy a place he meant to sell, and what was in him stayed his own: a closed door, a still face, a man who said milk the goats and tidy the place, and gave her nothing past it. But the watching changed in its kind, though he would not have owned it, and the watching was all that showed. In the first days he had watched the way a man watches an expense he expects to come to nothing. Now he stood in the barn door of a frosted morning with a halter forgotten in his hand, and watched her broad back bend and straighten over the pail, watched the easy sure way the wild herd lined up to her hand, watched his motherless son trail her with a kid goat in his arms and a look on his face the man had not seen there since the boy's mother went into the ground. And the man's jaw would tighten, and he would turn back into the dark of the barn without a word, and what it cost him to turn was not given to anyone to see. He ate her cheese at his own table, in silence. He set down his fork once, slow, the first time, and looked at the plain white round of it a moment too long, and then went on eating, and said nothing, and Orpha, who missed nothing, marked it, and let it lie, because a closed door is opened from the inside or not at all, and she had never in her life been the kind to knock. The milk came faster than two people, and a small boy could eat or churn, and so on a hard bright morning Orpha drove the wagon with the spare cans into Drum Hollow to sell the fluid milk at the creamery, because that was where dairy milk went, and she did not yet know any reason it should go anywhere else. The creamery was Quill's, Quill and Co. in gold, and Mordecai Quill himself came out to the platform to take her cans, a smooth, soft-handed man in a good coat, neither young nor old, with a smile that arrived a half-beat before it was wanted and stayed a half-beat past its welcome. He was all courtesy. He was sorry to hear the Halverson place was struggling so, a hard thing, a widower alone, a shame, and he hefted her first can onto the platform scale and watched the beam, and Orpha watched it too. She had been reading scales since before she could read words. Her mother's, the country stores, the weight of butter and the weight of curd were in her hands and her eyes the way another woman might know the weight of her own child. And the beam settled wrong. It hung a hair high and then dropped a hair low, and Quill read off a figure from the low of it, called it light, called the milk a touch thin and a touch warm, though it had ridden cold and clean under wet sacking the whole way in, and he rejected the second can outright with a sorry tilt of his soft head, and paid her for the rest at a price that would not have bought the salt to save it. He counted the coins into her broad red palm with his soft white fingers, and smiled his half-beat smile, and said he hoped she'd bring her milk to him regular. A woman had to take what she could get, times being what they were. Orpha closed her hand on the thin coin and said she was obliged, and climbed back to the wagon seat slow and certain, the way she did everything, and gave him not one flicker of what was moving behind her pale gray eyes. But it was moving. She had felt the beam drop under his soft hand the way you feel a board give under your boot before it breaks, and she sat the long cold road home, not thinking about the insult of the price, which she had borne worse, but about the beam, and the half-beat smile, and the gold letters on the window, turning the wrongness of that scale over and over in her steady mind like a stone she meant, in time, to set exactly where it would do the most good. She did not say a word about the scale that day. She loaded the half-empty cans back onto the wagon under the eyes of the creamery hands, took the few thin coins Mordecai Quill counted into her reddened palm with a smile that never reached his pale flat eyes, and drove the Halverson team back up the Antler Bend Road at a walk, watching the ruts and thinking. A lesser hand would have argued at the counter, and arguing was exactly what Quill wanted, for a woman who argued could be called shrill, unsteady, unfit, and word of it would travel to the bank the way a stink travels downwind. So Orpha held her tongue and held the picture of that beam in her mind instead, the way the brass arm had hung a hair high when her good morning milk sat in the pan, when by the heft of those cans in her own arms it should have dropped clean and true. A churn knows its own weight. A milker knows her own pails. She had carried more milk in her life than Quill had ever weighed, and the scale had lied to her, and she had seen it lie. She turned that over the whole 4 miles home and said nothing, because seeing a thing and being able to prove it were 2 different roads, and she had not yet found where the second one started. It was Hattie Sells who set her feet on it, 3 days later, leaning across the counter of the general store with the bolt cloth between them and her voice down low, though there was no one else in the place. Hattie had a way of telling you something while seeming to talk about the weather, and she did it now, smoothing the calico flat. There were 4 dairies on the Drum Hollow Road, she said, when Hattie first came to the country. 4 and the Halverson place made 5, and now there was Quill's Creamery and a deal of empty paddocks where the others had been. The Renslers had sold and gone to Idaho. The Booth widow had sold. Old Pettibone had hung on the longest, and then one spring his milk came back rejected 3 weeks running, soured, they said, though Pettibone had run a clean dairy 30 years, and that fall the bank had his place, and Quill had it from the bank a month after at a price that would shame a horse thief. Hattie folded the cloth. She did not say, "Quill is robbing you." She said only that it was a queer thing how every dairy that sold to that creamery seemed to spoil all at once, and how the man who bought the spoiled outland was always the same man who'd done the rejecting, and how the bank and the creamery seemed of one mind in a town that small. Then she asked after Toby, and whether the gray goat had freshened, and that was all. But Orpha drove home with the second road under her at last, knowing now what she was looking at. Knowing it was not bad luck, nor sour milk, nor a woman's failing, but a thing built on purpose, a slow, patient strangling, meant to lay the Halverson place on the auction block the way it had laid the others, with Mordecai Quill standing by, courteous as a deacon, to buy the bones cheap. And she understood, riding up the lane with the willows going gold, that the strangling had a clock on it. Caleb had told her none of it, but the place told her plenty if she only listened. The way he stood too long at the cold forge with a paper in his hand and folded it small when she came near. The way Asa went quiet whenever the word note came up. The way the creamery money she carried home each week came back lighter than the milk that left, so that the sum at the bottom of the ranch's reckoning grew instead of shrank, no matter how the pails filled. There was a forced note on the Halverson place, held at Eustace Vane's bank in town, and it would come due. And when it came due there would not be the coin to meet it, because the only buyer for the ranch's milk was the same man bent on owning the ranch's ground, and he had set the price of that milk himself at the bottom of his crooked scale. Caleb meant to sell out clean before that day came, take what little a quick sale left after the note, and walk away with the boy. That was the whole of his plan, and it was a beaten man's plan, and Orpha looked at the spring house she had scoured back to life, and the goats grown sleek and milky under her hand, and felt something in her go quiet and hard and certain, the way it went when a half-wild beast finally stood for the pail. She could not change the price Quill paid for fluid milk. He would always weigh it short. That was his to do, and no honest pail could fight a thumbed scale. So she would stop selling him fluid milk. The thought came whole and plain as she stood in the spring house that evening with her hand on the cool stone, and once it came, she could not see around it. Fresh milk was a perishing thing. It had to go down the road within the day. It had to be weighed on his scale and sold at his price, or poured to the hogs, and that was the leash he held the whole country on. But milk turned to cheese was a keeping thing. A hard wheel, salted and pressed and gold-rinded and aged in a cold cellar, did not spoil in a day or a week or a season. It did not have to cross Quill's counter at all. It could be held and carried and sold to a man Quill had no hold over, at a price Quill had no say in. Her mother had made such cheese in a stone spring house, not unlike this one, hard yellow wheels that hung in cloth through a winter and only grew the better for the keeping. And her mother's hands had taught Orpha's hands before they ever taught her to read. And in the flour sack on the shelf sat the dented copper churn and the wooden cheese hoop that were all she owned in the world. She had been thinking of them as the last of her dead. Standing there in the dusk, she saw them for what they were instead, the tools to break a stranglehold, carried 400 miles, and waiting. She started the next morning before light. There was more to a hard-keeping cheese than a soft crumble for the table, and she knew the most of it and meant to learn the rest by doing, which was the only way she had ever learned anything. She needed rennet, and got it the old way, a strip dried and saved when Caleb butchered the soured cow that had given them no milk in a year and would give them no more. The cow was worth more to the dairy dead than alive, and Orpha was not a woman to waste a thing that could be used. She needed a press, and Asa Dunmore built it for her, grumbling the whole while that he was a cattle hand and not a carpenter, his lame leg dragging as he hauled the timbers, but building it true all the same. A stout frame of cut posts with a flat oak bed and a lever beam and a hanging stone for the weight, so the wooden hoop her mother had pressed wheels in could be pressed harder and longer than a woman's 2 arms could manage. Asa had tasted her butter weeks back and gone silent over it, and a man who had once gone silent over her butter would build her a cheese press, though he called himself a fool for it the whole day through. The boy Toby carried salt from the store in a sack near as big as himself and would not be told to set it down, and stood at her elbow through the long heating of the milk, watching the way she watched the goats, learning by her shoulder the way she had learned by her mother's. She set the great copper kettle of morning milk over a low even fire and warmed it with her hand for the only thermometer she trusted, and when it was blood warm and no warmer she stirred in the rennet and drew the spoon out and made the country stand still. That was the part no clock could teach. She waited, and the goats called from the paddock, and Toby breathed at her side, and Asa's hammer had stopped, and the whole ruined and mended spring house held its breath with her, and then the milk set, all at once, the way a pond skins over in a hard frost, a clean trembling firmness under the surface that quivered and held when she pressed it with a clean finger. A clean break. She cut the curd then, long even strokes with the harp of wire she had bent herself, down and across and down again, and the whey rose pale green gold from the white cubes, and the smell of it filled the cold stone room, sweet and grassy and a little sharp, the smell of her childhood, the smell of work that paid. She cooked the curd and stirred it gentle as it firmed and shrank, dipped off the whey for the hogs and the kid goats, and packed the warm crumbled curd into the cloth-lined hoop bed by the double handful, pressing it down with her reddened churner's hands, and set the hoop in Asa's press, and laid on the stone. The first wheels were not all good, and she had known they would not be. The second day's batch broke ragged, the curd cut wrong, and the rind never knit, and she fed that wheel to the pigs without a word of grief and watched closer the next morning. A third went into the cellar fair and came out 3 days later with a blue bloom creeping where the rind had cracked, and she pared it and salted the wound and learned the cellar was a finger too damp in the low corner and moved the shelving up the wall a course of stone. She rubbed each good wheel with brine and turned it morning and night, every wheel, every day, so the rind would dry hard and even and gold all around, and seal the soft sweetness in. And the turning was a labor that did not end and did not show for weeks. the kind of labor the world never sees and never credits, the kind that had been Orpha's whole life. The rebuilt cellar at the back of the spring house filled slowly, with quiet ranks of pale wheels going slowly gold on their plank shelves, smelling of brine and stone and patience. And she would stand in the cool dark of it of an evening with the lantern, and look at her wheels the way another woman might look at gathered children, and count, and reckon, and let herself hope a careful, narrow inch. The cold snap came the third week of it, and near took everything. It came down out of the north overnight, the way Montana cold does, a wind with teeth in it, and a hard glittering frost on the willows by dawn, and Orpha woke to a goat in trouble. The young gray doe that had been first gentle to her hand was down in the straw, bloated and groaning, her sides heaving wrong. Toby found her and came running white-faced and silent the way grief had taught him to run, and Orpha was up and out in her shawl before she had her boots laced. A bloat could kill a goat in an hour. She knew the cause by the time she knelt in the straw. The doe had broken into the windfall apples under the old tree behind the paddock when the frost dropped them all at once, and gorged, and the cold and the green fruit had locked her gut. There was no animal doctor within 40 miles, and would have been no money to pay one. Orpha worked by what her mother had taught, and what the beasts themselves had taught her over 20 years of barns. She got the doe up, and walking against every wish of the suffering animal, kneading the swollen side with the heel of her hand, drenching her with warm water, and a little of the kitchen soda and a spoon of the good oil, walking her and kneading and walking. Toby leading with the lantern through the bitter dark, and Asa come limping out at last to take the other side, the three of them walking a sick goat in circles in the frost-white paddock for the better part of 2 hours, until the doe gave a great shuddering belch and another, and a killing pressure eased, and her sides came down, and she stood at last on her own 4 legs, gaunt and trembling but alive, and reached out and lipped at Orpha's sleeve. Saved by knowing, not by luck. Orpha had never once in her life been able to count on luck, and had long since stopped asking it for favors. But the frost had done more than found her a goat. When she came back into the spring house gray with cold and dawn, she found the new morning's batch in peril. The cold had crept under the door in the night and chilled the setting milk past taking, the curd gone slack and weeping and refusing to knit. A whole kettle of good milk on the edge of ruin. And milk was money, and money was the note. A green hand would have poured it, and called the day lost. Orpha did not pour it. She built the fire up careful, and warmed the room and the milk both. Slow, a degree at a time, coaxing the chilled curd the way she coaxed a frightened beast, adding back a touch more rennet, and waiting past all patience, and the curd came together at last. Late and stubborn but sound, and she pressed it and salted it and set it on the shelf with the rest, and it made as fine a wheel as any in the cellar. She had lost no milk, and lost no goat, and lost no day, and she sat down on the stone bench when it was done with her back against the cool wall, and her hands shaking at last, now that they were allowed to, and let herself be tired, and Toby came and sat against her side without a word, and that was the first time the boy had ever leaned his weight on her of his own choosing. Caleb had been at the paddock for the walking of the goat, had taken the lantern from Toby's hands without being asked, and held it high so the boy's arm could rest, had walked the cold round with them an hour, and gone back to the house only when the doe stood on her own. He said nothing then, and said nothing now, but Orpha, scrubbing the kettle in the gray morning, was aware of him standing in the spring house door longer than a man stands who means only to look at the weather, his eyes moving over the ranked wheels in the cellar dark, over the press Asa had built, over her bent back and her ruined and mended room, with something in his still face she had no name for and would not let herself name, for naming it was not her place, and hoping it was a road she had learned the hard way not to take. He went off to his cold chores. She finished the kettle. But the door had stood open a long while, and she had felt his looking on her back the whole of it, like the first thin warmth of a sun that has not yet cleared the ridge. It was that same week, carrying a basket to Hattie's, that Orpha learned how little time the cellar's slow gold had left. Hattie had it from her cousin who kept Vane's books, and gave it to Orpha plain this time, no talk of weather. The note on the Halverson place was called. Not coming due in the spring, as Caleb had reckoned, called, moved up. The date set at 6 weeks, and not a day passed. With Quill's polished hand somewhere in the moving of it, the way his hand was in everything that fell on a Drumhollow dairy. 6 weeks. Orpha stood in the lane with the basket on her arm and did the cold sum she had done 100 times in the cellar lantern light, the sum of how many wheels stood on the shelves and how many more she could press before the milk dropped off with the cold, and how long a hard wheel must lie to come ripe and gold-rinded and worth the coin a keeping cheese could fetch, and the two reckonings would not meet. The first wheels, the soundest ones, the ones just now taking their proper rind and beginning to weep their first true gold at the surface, would come ripe, with barely days to spare. There was no margin in it anywhere. There was a buyer she had only heard whispered of, a railroad and hotel man named Renfrew who would pay for cheese that traveled. And there was a crooked scale she had seen lie with her own gray eyes. And there were 6 weeks, and 40 miles of frost-hard road between the springhouse and any of it. She turned and walked home in the cold, past the willows gone bare overnight, up the Antler Bend lane to the place that was not yet hers and not yet anyone's to take. And she did not hurry, and she did not falter. She had learned long ago that the work answers, if you only outlast everything that bets against it. And she set her broad shoulders to the wind and went to turn her wheels. The first hard frost came down over Antler Bend in the dark before dawn, and Orpha Brand was already awake to meet it, standing in the doorway of the rebuilt springhouse with a lantern in her reddened hand and her breath smoking white in the cold. The wheels were taking. She could see it in the gray light that crept up over the willow brakes. The first gold rain drawing tight across the round faces of the cheese where they sat ranked on the cellar shelves, each one turned and salted and rubbed by her own broad hand until the skin began to bloom the color of a winter sun. She had counted the days against the note the way a body counts heartbeats, and she knew to the morning how many were left before Eustace Vane would open his ledger at the Drumhollow Bank and read out the figure that would put Caleb Halverson and his motherless boy out onto the Antler Bend Road for good. Not enough days. The cheese was not ready, the rind was not set, and Mordecai Quill was rejecting their fluid milk at his creamery scale week on week with a smile so polite it could have curdled the cream by itself. A lesser hand would have begged. Orpha did not have a begging bone in her broad and heavy body. She had a churn, a hoop, a herd of goats nobody else could read, and a pair of pale gray eyes that had been catching the wrong settle of Quill's scale beam for 3 weeks running. She went down to the pens to milk, because the answer to everything she had ever faced had started with the next chore done well. The goats came to her now without being called, the half-wild billies and the rangy nannies crowding to her broad shadow in the frost-stiff grass, lining up at the milking stand of their own accord. She had names for every one and an ear for every udder, and she stripped the warm milk down into the scalded pails in a steady hiss, while Toby Halverson squatted on the top rail above her, silent as ever but closer every morning, his small motherless face turned to watch her hands. He had taken to carrying her stool without being asked, and to naming the kid goats after her, which she pretended not to notice, and noticed with her whole heart. When the pails were full, she set the cleanest, sweetest milk aside in the springhouse for the press, and sent only what she had to send down the road to Quill, and watched when the cans went down on his platform scale, exactly where his beam came to rest. Asa Dunmore drove the cans in that morning, his bad legs stuck out stiff, and Orpha rode in beside him, for she had asked to come. "You'll want to keep your mouth shut and your eyes open at that scale," she told him. And Asa, who had bet aloud the day she came that she'd quit by Sunday and had not stopped being ashamed of it since, only grunted and slapped the lines and said, "Woman, I been keepin' my eyes open at that thievin' scale since before you was weaned, and a fat lot of good it's done me." But he watched. They both watched. Quill came out onto his creamery platform in his clean town coat, and he had his man hoist the Halverson cans onto the scale one by one, and he read the weights aloud and wrote them in his tally book, and every figure he called was light. Orpha said nothing. She had a milkmaid's eye for weight the way some men have an eye for horseflesh, and she had hefted those cans into the wagon herself an hour gone, and Quill's beam settled a good 2 pounds shy on every can, and his pencil made it shy by 3. He rejected a third of it outright. Too thin, he said, too off. His nose wrinkling at milk Orpha knew was clean as snowmelt, and paid her a creamery scrip that would not have bought the salt to cure it. "A hard season for the small dairies," he said pleasantly. "A body wonders how long the Halverson place can carry on. You tell Caleb my offer for the land stands, and stands generous." And he tipped his hat to her, with a look in his eye that said he had measured her too, and found her light. Orpha looked at his tally book and his scale and his soft, clean hands, and she smiled back at him, slow and certain, because she had just seen the whole of it. On the ride home, she laid it out for Asa in her quiet, unflustered way. The milk was good, they both knew it. So it was not the milk. It was the man, and the scale, and the book. Quill was not failing to buy honest milk. He was refusing it on purpose, underweighing it on purpose, paying scrip nobody could spend anywhere but his own store, and starving out every small dairy on the Antler Bend Road 1 rejected can at a time. Not because he could not use the milk, but because he wanted the land the milk came off of. Cheap, at the auction block, the day the note fell due. "He's not buying milk," she said. "He's buying ruin. Ours, and the Pratts, and old Lindvist's down the creek. He underweighs us till we can't make the note, then he buys the land for a song." Asa worked his jaw and spat over the wheel. Knowed he was crooked, never could lay a hand on how. "The scale," Orpha said, "and the book that keeps the scales lie." Asa looked at her sidelong then. This broad, heavy woman the town had called too much of everything, and something in the old hand's grizzled face shifted over from grudging into something nearer to awe, because she had seen in 3 weeks what he had failed to lay hold of in 20 years. That afternoon she walked into Drumhollow on her own 2 feet, 3 miles in, her loose strands of wheat-brown hair working free of their pins by the time she reached the boardwalk, and she went into Hattie Sells's general store and stood at the counter among the barrels of crackers and the bolts of calico, and she asked Hattie a question. Not for credit, not for pity. She asked who in this whole country bought a cheese that could keep. Hattie, who had shown her the only plain kindness she'd had in Drumhollow, set down her dust rag and understood at once that something had changed. "Keep how long?" Hattie asked. "Long enough to ride a freight car to the end of the line and come off sound," Orpha said. "Long enough to feed a hotel dining room a month after it left my cellar. A hard cheese. A traveling cheese. Gold rind. Won't weep, won't spoil. Who buys that?" Hattie was quiet a moment, then came out from behind her counter and looked down the road toward the depot where the spur line came in, and she said a name. "Renfrew, mister. Renfrew. He provisions the railroad hotel up the line and the stage stops between, and he has been to my counter twice this season cursing the want of a cheese that'll travel. Because Quill's Creamery cheese is a soft, watered, weeping thing that turns to soap before it clears the county, and Renfrew can't put it on a hotel table. He buys by the standing contract. He pays in bank coin, not scrip. And he pays dear." She turned and looked Orpha full in the face. "But you understand what you'd be doing. You'd be selling a cheese Quill can't make, into a market Quill can't touch, and Quill is not a forgiving man." Orpha looked back at her, slow and certain, her broad, capable hands flat on the worn counter, and said, "I understand it fine. When does Mr. Renfrew come through?" Thursday next, Hattie told her, the down train, the noon stop at the depot. And then Hattie did the second kind thing. She said she would send word up the line that a woman with a real keeping cheese would meet his train, so Renfrew would not step off and walk past a big, quiet farm woman with a flour sack and never know what he'd missed. Orpha thanked her with the few words she had. bought a paper of pins she did not need so as not to take the kindness for nothing, and walked home into the wind with the whole shape of the thing now standing clear in her mind, two-pronged and plain. The contract was the first prong, a standing cheese contract with Renfrew that would pay real bank coin enough and more to meet the called note. But the contract alone would not undo Quill, and it did not unbend a doctored scale. Quill could yet swear to Vane that the Halverson milk was off, thin, rejected fair and square, and let his crooked tally book speak against her. So she would need the second prong. She would need proof of the lie. She got it from a man so worn down he had almost stopped believing he could give it. Lemuel Pike was Quill's creamery hand, a thin, stoop-shouldered young fellow with chapped hands and a hunted look, paid in the same scrip he weighed out to others, kept close to the bone by the very man he served. Orpha had marked him at the platform scale, the way his eyes slid off hers when Quill called the false weights, the way his jaw set when his master rejected a clean can, the small mute shame of a man doing a thing he knew was wrong because a hungrier thing than conscience was at his door. She did not corner him. She found him alone 2 evenings later behind the creamery where he came to draw water, and she did not threaten and she did not preach. She had brought a wedge cut off her first soft cheese wrapped in clean cloth, and she put it in his chapped hand and told him to take it home to his folks, and said, "I'm not asking you for anything tonight, Lemuel Pike. I'm telling you, you don't have to be the man he's making you into." And she turned to go. It was Pike who stopped her. It came out of him in the dark in a low, fast, shamed voice, all of it. The scale beam filed and reset so it read 2-pound light on every 100. The tally book kept double. One set of figures for the dairies and the real set locked in Quill's desk. The milk rejected, not for being off, but for being honest. The standing word with Vane at the bank that the moment a dairy missed its note Quill's offer would be there to take the land. Pike had kept the rejected milk slips, every one, because some stubborn, unbroken thing in him had not let him burn them, and he had a tally of his own, the true weights set against the called weights, going back through the whole starving autumn. He would put his name to it and swear it before Vane in the town. He had been waiting, he said, his voice breaking on it, for one single soul in this county to be worth getting himself thrown out into the cold for, and she was it. Orpha put her broad hand on the thin young man's shoulder in the dark and told him he had found his spine now, and that was the only hour that counted. She walked home under the cold stars with the proof of it taking shape behind her gray eyes. And at the spring house Caleb Halverson was standing in the doorway with the lantern lit, waiting on her, and that was a new thing too. He had begun this last week to be where she was. Not in the doorway watching from the barn the way he had all autumn, his grief a closed door, his interior a thing she could only read from the outside, but at her shoulder. He had carried salt for her without a word. He had mended the cellar latch. Tonight he had waited up because she was out after dark, and when she came up out of the willow dark into the light he did not ask her where she'd been. He only took the empty cloth from her hand and folded it, careful, and gave it back, and said only, "Cold out." It was not much. From Caleb Halverson, who had hired her to milk a few goats so he could sell out clean and walk away, it was nearly a speech. She told him plain what she had, the contract she would seek Thursday, Renfrew, the coin, and the proof of Quill's scale that Pike would swear to. She did not soften it, and she did not boast it. Caleb listened the whole way through, and at the end he did not tell her it was too bold or not a woman's place. He looked out at the dark cellar where the gold-rind wheels were ripening against the calendar, and then at her, and he said, "What do you need from me?" Not a question. A man putting his hands at her disposal. She told him, the wagon sound, the gray mare shod, and him beside her on the seat Thursday when she met that train, because a contract that would save his land ought to be made with the land's own man sitting there to make it. He nodded once, and that was settled. But Quill was not a fool, and a polite, menacing man who has spent an autumn measuring a place knows when the wind has shifted on it. Word travels in a small dairy town, and somewhere between Hattie's counter and the creamery yard the word reached Quill that the fat milk woman out at the Halverson place had been asking who buys a cheese that keeps, and that she'd been seen talking low to his own hand, Lemuel Pike, behind the creamery in the dark. Quill did the arithmetic of it as quick as Orpha had done his, and he did not like the sum. On the Wednesday, the day before Renfrew's train, Eustace Vane rode out to the Halverson place with a paper in his coat, stiff and apologetic and not meeting Caleb's eye, to say the note had been called early. Quill had pressed the bank, had paid down a favor to buy it, and the figure due at month's end was now due Friday morning at the bank's opening. 2 full weeks moved up, and there was nothing, Vane said, twisting his hat, that he could do. It was the law of the paper. Orpha stood on the porch and listened to it with her hands folded and her face calm as still water, and inside her the whole careful clock she'd built ran its gears against the new time and held. Thursday she met the train. Friday she met the bank. There was a day in it, thin as a knife, but there. And then Quill did the last small mean thing, the thing that showed he had begun to be afraid of her. Thursday at dawn, when Caleb hitched the gray mare and Orpha came out to the wagon in her clean apron with the first finished gold-rind wheel cradled in her 2 arms like a living thing, the Antler Bend road was blocked. Quill's creamery wagon stood crosswise in the narrow cut where the road ran between the creek and the bluff, a wheel off it and propped on a stone, 2 of Quill's men loitering by it with their hands in their pockets, and a polite word of regret on their lips about the broken axle that surely would be mended directly, no later than nightfall, long after the noon train had come and gone. They had her boxed. The down train would not wait. Renfrew would step off, find no one, and step back on, and the contract that was the whole first prong of her plan would ride away up the line and not come again before the bank opened Friday. Orpha sat on the wagon seat with the gold wheel in her lap and looked at the blocked road and the loitering men, and she did not raise her voice, and she did not despair. Because despair was a luxury for people who had not spent their whole lives being underestimated and learning the patient way through. She looked at the creek, low and brown in the frost, and the gravel bar where the willows thinned. "Asa," she said, "is the old ford below the bend still hard-bottomed?" The lame old hand grinned a grin with half its teeth gone. "Hard as a banker's heart, woman." She handed the wheel to Toby to hold. The boy had climbed up beside her without being told, her shadow, her chosen, and she told Caleb to take the mare down off the road and through the willow break to the gravel bar and across the old ford and up the depot side, the long, slow way the wagons used before the road was cut, the way only somebody who knew this land would think to take. Caleb looked at her and at the loitering men who had thought a broken axle was enough to stop her, and for the first time in the whole long autumn the corner of his stoic mouth moved, almost, into something that on another man's face would have been the beginning of a smile. He turned the gray mare's head off the road and down toward the water, and as the wagon dropped off the cut and into the willows, going slow and sure over the gravel toward the ford and the depot and the noon train, Orpha Brand sat broad and steady on the seat with the boy pressed warm against her arm and the gold-rind wheel safe in his lap. And she did not look back at Quill's men standing baffled by their useless wagon. She looked ahead, the way she always had, to the next thing that had to be done well, because the train was coming, the cheese was good, the proof was sworn, and the road, for anyone who truly knew the country, had never once been closed. The first hard frost came in the night before she meant to drive, and Orpha Brand was up in the dark of it, before any rooster, standing in the rebuilt spring-house with a tallow candle cupped in her reddened hand and the cold breathing down through the willow brakes. The wheels lay on their plank shelves in rows now, each turned and rubbed and turned again across the long weeks, and the first one, the oldest, pressed in her mother's wooden hoop on the night Asa mended the paddock rail, wore a rind the color of old harness leather, dry and firm and ringing faintly when she rapped it with a knuckle. She had read 1,000 small signs to bring it this far. The bloom of it, the weight gone lighter than the green wheels because the whey had wept out clean. The trial plug she had cut 3 days back tasting nut and grass and a faint salt tang that meant it had aged true and would carry. She wrapped it now in clean muslin and a square of oilcloth and set it in the bottom of the flour sack that had carried her copper churn 400 miles, and the churn she left standing on the stone shelf where she had set it the first dusk, because the churn was the vow and the wheel was the proof, and a body did not carry her vows to market. She carried what they made. Outside, the yard was rimed silver, and the goats murmured in the paddock, awake to the cold, and Toby Halverson was already at the rail in his too-big coat, with his breath going up white. Because the boy slept light as a barn cat now, and woke to whatever she woke to. He had taken to standing where she would have to step around him, which was his way of asking to come, and she had learned to read that the way she read the goats. "Get your other stocking on," she said, low, "and tell your father the wagon goes at first gray." He went pelting for the house, and she stood a moment with the sack against her hip and looked at the ranch coming up out of the dark. The caved spring-house roof patched now with sound shingle, the split rail straightened, the soured old cow back in milk because she had coaxed her there a cupful at a time, the whole dying spread quietly, not dying, and let herself feel, for one breath, how far a woman could come on nothing but steady hands and refusing to quit. Then she went to harness the team. Caleb came out into the gray with his collar up and his face shut the way it always was, and he did not offer to take the sack, which she would not have given him. But he checked the harness she had already checked, a thing he had not done a month ago, when he had stood in the barn door watching her like a man watching weather he could not change. When she climbed up to the seat, the wagon springs taking her weight with a creak, he climbed up beside her without being asked, took the lines, and looked at her once, sidelong, in the way she had stopped trying to name. "Renfrew's man keeps the provisioner's office at the rail end past the creamery," he said. It was the most he had said about her plan in all the days of it, and she understood he was telling her he had thought about where she was going. "I know the way," she said. Toby showed me on the store map, and the boy, wedged small between them with the cold reddening his ears, looked straight ahead down the Antler Bend road like a man entrusted with a great office. And that was how the three of them drove out at first gray with the one gold-rind wheel in the sack toward the thing that would either save the place or not. The provisioner's office at the rail end was a low-frame building with a stove going and the smell of coffee and harness oil, and Mr. Renfrew was a brisk, square man with ink on his cuffs and a way of looking at a thing as though already pricing it. Hattie Sells had sent word ahead, by way of the freight clerk who was her sister's boy, that the Halverson woman had a hard cheese worth a man's mourning. Renfrew did not rise when they came in out of the cold. He looked at Orpha, at the size of her, the work dress under the heavy shawl, the reddened churner's hands, and she saw the old bet pass behind his eyes, the bet the whole county had made and lost, and she set the sack on his plank counter and unwrapped the oilcloth and the muslin and laid the wheel bare in the lamplight, gold rinded and round and ringing when she turned it. "Cut where you like," she said. "It'll cut clean and it'll carry. That's the whole of what you want to know." Renfrew took up his own knife, not hers, which she respected, and drew it down through the rind and into the paste, and the cut face came open pale gold and close and even, no eyes, no cracks, the way a keeping cheese should. He turned the plug under his nose first, then ate it standing. The face a person made in the first chew told the whole tale before any word came. And Renfrew's face did the thing she was waiting for, the pricing went out of it, and for one plain moment he was just a man eating something good on a cold morning, and then the merchant came back sharper than before, because now he knew what he had. "This keeps," he said. It was not a question, but she answered it. 2 months proven on the shelf, and it'll go 4, and the rind only hardens for the road. Your stage stops, your rail hotels, it'll ride a freight car to the end of the line and cut the same as it cut here. Your creamery cheese won't go a week past Drum Hollow without weeping and souring, which is why your man's been throwing half of it out before it reaches your tables." Renfrew looked at her a long beat. "You know a deal about my trouble for a milkwoman," he said, and she said, "I know my own trade, and yours is the back end of mine," and Caleb, by the stove, made a low sound that in another man would have been a laugh. They struck the contract there at the plank counter with the stove ticking. A standing order, wheels by the dozen, taken at the rail end every fortnight. Weighed honest on Renfrew's own beam and paid in coin on delivery at a price that did not stoop and did not haggle and did not, when she ran the figure against the note coming due, leave her short. It outpaid anything the creamery had ever offered an honest dairy. It outpaid, by a clean margin, the whole of Caleb Halverson's forced banknote. She did not let her face change while Renfrew wrote it out and turned the book for her to make her mark, but under the counter her thumb pressed hard into her own palm, the way it had the night the first wheel took its rind. She signed her name full, Orpha Brand, and Renfrew counted the first coin against the first wheel into her reddened palm, and the weight of it was a thing she would remember in her hands for the rest of her life. But coin in the palm was not coin on the banker's table, and the other half of the morning was the harder half, because Mordecai Quill had moved the call of the note up when he sensed the turn, set it for noon this very day at the Drum Hollow Bank, thinking to take the place while the wheels still sat green on her shelves and the contract still lived only in her head. He had not reckoned on her driving past his creamery to Renfrew's office before the bank doors opened. He had not reckoned, most of all, on Lemuel Pike. They came back through Drum Hollow with the sun full up and a hard, cold light on the false fronts. And the town was already gathering the way a town does when it smells a man being put off his land, at the creamery dock, on the bank steps, in the door of Hattie's store, and the same mouths that had called her the fat milkwoman in the spring now watched her drive up the main street with a banker's noon hanging over her, waiting to see her fail. Because that was the story they had told themselves, and they did not yet know it had a different ending. Hattie Sells came out onto her store stoop with her apron twisted in her hands, and behind her stood a thin, stooped man in a creamery apron with his hat in his hands and his face gone the gray of a man who has not slept. Lemuel Pike, who had carried Quill's books and watched Quill's beam settle wrong for 2 years on wages that never came up, and who had, 3 nights past at Hattie's kitchen table with Orpha's gray eyes steady on him, finally written down in his own cramped hand what he knew. A man does not turn on the hand that feeds him, however thin the feeding, without it costing him his sleep, and she had seen the cost of it move in him those 3 nights. She got down and went to him and did not crowd him, only said, "Lo, you don't have to come in. I can carry the paper. Your name on it is enough." And Lemuel Pike looked at her and at the gathered town, and put his hat on his head with both hands like a man dressing for church, and said, "I'll stand for what I wrote." So they went up the bank steps together, Orpha with the contract and the honest coin and the way tickets she had kept these long weeks, Lemuel Pike with his signed account, Caleb a half step behind her shoulder where for a month now he had quietly chosen to stand, and Toby small at his side, and went in to meet Mordecai Quill. The banker's room smelled of cold ash and ledger leather. Eustace Vane sat behind his desk with the note laid out, and his pen ready and his wary, narrow face giving nothing, and Mordecai Quill stood at the window with his hat on his knee and his smooth, polite land-hungry smile already on, a buyer's bill of sale half out of his coat, certain of his noon. He looked at Orpha, and the smile did not slip, because he did not yet understand that the morning had already been lost to him at the rail end before the bank doors opened. "Miss Brand," he said, pleasant as poured cream, "I'd not have thought a dairy hand part of bank business. A brave little effort, milking goats out of a caved springhouse all autumn. A pity it's come too late." And Orpha set her flour sack on Vane's desk, and out of it she took, not a wheel this time, but the standing contract in Renfrew's ink-cuffed hand, and laid it before the banker square. "The note's how much?" she said to Vane, plain and due today, you call it." Vane named the sum. She counted Renfrew's coin onto the desk against it, the first payment of the standing order. And where it fell short she laid the contract beside it, signed and sealed, a fortnight's wheels, and the next at a price the banker could read for himself. "That's the coin in hand and the trade behind it," she said. "The notes met today and cleared inside the month, and you can wire Renfrew this hour if you doubt the paper." Vane read the contract slow, his pen gone still, and the wariness in his narrow face turned, by degrees, into something nearly respect. Quill's smile worked harder. "A scrap of paper from a provisioner," he said, "against a forced note and a buyer ready to pay cash on the desk. Mr. Vane knows which is the sounder transaction." And that was the moment Orpha had been driving toward since the day her gray eyes first caught his beam settle wrong, and she did not raise her voice, because she had learned long since to let the work answer and never the temper. She laid the weight tickets on the desk, weeks of them, every honest pail her ranch had brought to Quill's creamery, and the light cook tally he had paid against it. The short weight plain in 2 columns for any man with sums to read. "These are what your creamery weighed against what we brought, Mr. Quill," she said. "Every honest dairy in Drum Hollow's got the same if they kept it, and the reason none of you could make the figures come right is that the beam was made to lie." And then she stepped aside, and there was Lemuel Pike with his hat in his hands and the paper out of his apron, and he laid it on the desk beside the tickets, and in his own cramped hand it told the whole of it, the shim set under the creamery scale's beam, the books kept double. 2 years of honest milk weighed light, so one dairy after another would starve and sell cheap. And the sideword with the bank to call each failing note the day the dairy went under. He had named the dates, and named himself the hand that set the shim on Quill's order, and had signed it Lemuel Pike, his mark plain. The room went very still. Eustace Vane looked at the signed account, at the way tickets, at the honest contract, and at the smooth landman at his window. And a banker is a creature of figures before he is anything else, and these figures all told one tale. He set down his pen. "I'll not call this note," he said to Quill, his wary voice gone flat and cold. "And you and I will be a good while at this scale of yours before I lend another $1 on your word." Quill's smile was gone now. The polite menace had nothing under it but the menace. And that, in a banker's office with a signed confession on the desk and the town crowding the doorway, was nothing at all. He gathered his hat and his half-drawn bill of sale and went out through the parting townsfolk without his courtesy and without his land, and the story he had told the county about himself cracked across like a green wheel cut too soon, and the whole town stood in the cold and watched it crack. And then the strangest, sweetest part, the part Orpha would tell over to herself for years. Hattie had brought the rest of that first cut wheel up from the store on a board, and on the bank steps, in the hard noon light, the people of Drum Hollow who had called her too much of everything tasted what too much of everything had made. Passed the plugs hand to hand, the freight clerk and the depot men and the wary wives and old Asa Dunmore, who had bet aloud she'd quit by Sunday and never once been gladder to lose a bet, and the same mouths that had sneered the fat milkwoman across the spring went quiet around the taste and then loud again with a different note in them altogether. Asa thumped his cane and told anyone who'd hold still that in 20 years he never. And Orpha stood at the top of the steps with the empty flour sack folded over her arm and her wheat-brown hair working loose the way it always did by noon, and felt the thing turn under the whole town like the season turning, contempt gone to respect, not in a stroke, but the way a cheese takes its rind, slow and certain and earned. The note was met and cleared. The place was saved by curd and patience, and a thin man's conscience, and a woman who had never once been allowed to be enough until she made herself, plainly, more than they had ever bet she could be. She did not look for Caleb in the crowd. She had stopped, somewhere in the long weeks, expecting to be looked at the way she wanted to be looked at, because a woman learns not to expect it, and the not expecting is a kind of armor. But he was there when she turned, come up the steps to her shoulder again, the boy's mittened hand in his, and he was not looking at the cheese or the routed land man. He was looking at her, full on, the closed door of his face come open at last in the noon light. Looking at the broad-backed, certain woman the county had called too much of everything and seeing, she could read it now, plain as she read a beam settling true, that she had been, all along, exactly enough. Exactly enough to gentle a maddened goat and a grieving man and a silent boy, to take a dying place and a borrowed roof and churn the whole of it into something gold. He did not say it. He was not a man who said things in front of a town. But he reached out, there on the bank steps with Drumhollow watching, and took the folded flour sack off her arm to carry it down to the wagon, which was the smallest thing and the largest, and Toby looked up at the both of them and grinned with the gap in his teeth, and the three of them went down into the cold, bright noon. The spring house, 4 miles out on the Antler Bend Road, sat humming on its stone with the wheels ripening and the goats murmuring in the willow brakes, waiting for them to come home and turn the next run, and there was nothing now between them and that road but the drive. And the one thing, smaller than a note and larger than a ranch, that neither of them had yet found the way to say. The frost came hard that next morning, the first real frost of the season, silvering the split-rail paddocks and the willow brakes down by the creek, rhyming the long grass so it crunched underfoot and broke off in little glass spears when the goats nosed through it. Orpha Brand was up before the light, the way she always was, her breath smoking in the cold of the spring house as she set the lamp on the stone shelf beside her mother's dented copper churn and looked down the cool, dim length of the place at the wheels of cheese laid out in their straight ranks on the new pine boards. Gold, rinded, hard, sweating their slow honest sweat in the dark, every one of them weighed and tallied and spoken for now. The standing contract sealed and the note paid, and Mordecai Quill's doctored scales hauled out into the Drumhollow daylight for the whole town to see. It should have felt like an ending. It did not. It felt like the morning of a thing only just begun, and she could not have said why, except that she had learned long ago not to trust a quiet that came too easy, and this quiet was not easy at all. It was full to the brim of something she had not let herself put a name to. She moved down the row, turning the wheels a quarter so they would cure even, her strong reddened hands sure on the cool waxed rinds, and she did not let herself look out the open door to where the barn lamp had just come alight across the yard, where a tall man in a sheepskin coat had stepped out into the frost and stood a moment looking, not at the cattle, not at the goats coming down off the willow slope in their grumbling line, but at the spring house door. At her, she felt it the way she felt weather coming, a change in the pressure of the morning, and she kept her eyes on the cheese and her hands on the work and waited, the way she had waited her whole life, letting the labor answer for her because she had never once in her 28 years been able to count on anything else. Toby came first, the way he always came first, banging out the kitchen door with his coat half on and one boot untied, his thin face still creased from sleep, and lit up the moment he saw the kid goats butting at the paddock rail for him. He had been the first to thaw, that motherless boy of about 7 who had not spoken a word to her for the better part of a month after she came. And now he could not be got to hush. He had a way of trailing her from pen to spring house to cellar with a running account of everything the goats had done in the night, every nip and every bleep, as though she had not been there to see it herself. He crossed the frosted yard at a dead run and fetched up against the spring house doorframe, panting, and held up something cupped in his 2 cold, reddened hands. A nest of late thimbleberries, half frozen, gone soft and dark, the last of the years scavenged off the bushes down by the creek, where the frost had not yet killed them all. "For you," he said, and would not look at her while he said it, looking instead at the cheese, at the lamp, at his own untied boot. Pa said the first frost would get 'em. I beat the frost. Orpha took the berries from him as gravely as if he had handed her a king's ransom, and ate 2 of them then and there, cold and tart and bursting, and told him they were the finest she had tasted in all her life, which was no more than the truth, and watched the boy go red to the ears with the pleasure of it and bolt off again to the goats so she would not see his face. She stood holding the rest of the little dark berries in her open palm, and felt the morning shift again under her. that full and waiting thing, and she thought, not for the first time and not for the last, that whatever else came of this place and this work and this hard country, the boy had chosen her. And that alone would have been worth the 400 miles. Asa Dunmore came next, lame and slow and grumbling about the cold in his bad hip, leading the soured old milk cow that was not soured any longer. Orpha had brought her back to a thin, sweet flow with patience and warm mash and the laying on of those churner's hands, and the old hand had watched it happen with his jaw set, like a man watching a dead thing get up and walk. He had bet aloud that first week that the fat milk woman would quit by Sunday. He had said it in the yard where she could hear, the way the whole county had said its cruelties out loud, sure as anything that a woman built broad through the shoulder and heavy through the hip and arm, a woman they had all agreed was too much of everything to be of any use, would break and run inside the month. He did not say such things now. He had mended her paddock rails and rebuilt her cheese press and stood at the bank rail behind her when she laid Quill's crooked tally books on the counter. And last evening, when the town had crowded into Hattie Sells's store to taste the wheels that had beaten the creamery man at his own game, old Asa had stood by the cracker barrel and told anybody who would hold still that he had known from the first day there was iron in her, which was the boldest lie Orpha had ever heard a man tell, and the kindest, and she had let him tell it. Now he tied the cow off at the post and squinted at her through the springhouse door and said only, "Frost'll firm them rinds up handsome." And she said it would, and that was the whole of their morning's conversation, and it was enough. There was a way men of that country had of saying everything that mattered by saying nearly nothing at all, and she had come to love them for it, this lame old man chief among them, this whole hard place that had bet against her and lost. She finished the row, banked the lamp, and went out into the rising light. The sun was just clearing the long blue ridge to the east, and it came across the frosted paddocks in one wide, slow flood of gold, lighting up every silvered rail and every breath cloud, and the steam rising off the springhouse roof where the warmth of the curing wheels met the cold, so that the little stone building seemed to smoke gently in the morning like a thing alive and breathing. And it was. The springhouse was humming. She could hear it if she stood still, the low contented work of it, the slow business of milk becoming something that would keep and travel and feed and pay, and she stood in the yard with the last of Toby's berries still in her palm and let the gold light come over her wide sun-warmed face and her ruddy cheeks and her wheat-brown hair already working loose from its morning pins. And she was, for that one moment, entirely and unaccountably happy, with no good reason she could point to and every reason in the world. Caleb came across the yard to her then. She heard his boots on the frozen ground before she turned, that even unhurried tread she had come to know better than her own heartbeat over these weeks, and when she turned, he was already close, closer than he had stood to her in all the time she had been on the place, his hat in his hand, which was a thing she had never once seen. Caleb Halverson bareheaded in the cold, the frostlight catching the gray that had come early into his dark hair, the lines that grief had cut around his eyes standing plain in the low sun. He had only ever meant to have the goats milked. She knew that. She had always known it. He had tacked up his notice and sent it 400 miles to fetch a woman of capable hands to milk and tend the goats and keep house, room and board, no references required, because he meant to tidy the place and sell it clean and walk away from the dairy his dead wife had loved, and the debt that was strangling it, and the whole green grave of a country that had taken everything from him. He had hired her to close a door, not to open one. He had been cold to her, and purely transactional, milk the goats, tidy the place, and his interior had stayed a closed door these many weeks, while everything around it changed, while the goats came gentle to her hand, and the boy began to laugh again, and the old man's contempt turned to fierce defense, and the wheels took their rinds in the dark, and the man Quill was undone, and the note was met, and cleared, and the auction block hauled back from the very edge of his life. All of it had moved, and Caleb Halverson had stood in his barn door and watched it move, watched her, the way a man watches weather he has decided not to feel. And now he stood bareheaded in the frost with his hat in his two hands, and the door that had been closed in him these long weeks was, she saw, no longer closed. They're saying in town, he began, and stopped and turned his hat once around in his hands and tried again. They're saying in town, you're the one saved the place. It was not what he had meant to say. She could see that too. He was a man who had spent a year teaching himself to say nothing, and the saying of even this much cost him visibly, the words coming slow and rough as though hauled up out of a long dry well. Asa says it. Toby says it near every hour. Renfrew's man said it, signing the papers. The bank says it. He looked at her then, full on, those weary eyes going over her face the way her own gray eyes went over a wheel of cheese reading its bloom, careful and entire, missing nothing. I'd not say it sooner because and there he stopped again, and the muscle worked in his jaw, and Orpha, who had been underestimated her whole life and had learned the long art of waiting, waited. She did not help him. Some things a person had to walk the whole way to by himself, or they were not worth the arriving. The goats grumbled down the line. The spring house smoked its gentle smoke. Somewhere off by the paddock, Toby was telling the kid goats a great long secret. I'd not say it sooner. Caleb got out at last, very low, because I knew once I'd said it, I'd not be able to let you go. And I'd hired you to let go of. The frost cracked somewhere out in the long grass. She said nothing. There was nothing in her to say, or rather, there was everything, and it was all so large it could not be got through the narrow gate of words, so she did the thing she always did, and let her stillness answer for her, and stood there, broad-backed and steady in the gold light, with the boy's berries warming in her closed hand, and waited to see what the man would do with the door he had finally opened. He came the last step. He was near enough now that she could see the gray light caught in his lashes and the place where he had nicked himself shaving in the cold dawn. And he lifted one hand, slow, the way a man lifts a hand to a beast he is not sure of, and tucked a loose strand of her wheat-brown hair, the one that always worked free first, back behind her ear, his rough fingers just barely grazing the warm skin of her temple as he did it. That was all. It was nothing at all. It was the whole world. No man in all her 28 years had touched her so, as though she were a thing worth the careful handling, a thing precious and not too much, exactly enough. And she felt the small, devastating tenderness of it go all through her like the first warmth coming back into a cold, numbed hand. He did not ask her. He was not a man who could have got the question out, not that morning, not perhaps for a long while yet, and she found she did not need him to. "Stay," he said. Just that. Not a question, his voice gone rough as the bark of the willows. "Stay, Orpha." And she looked up into that grief-worn, opened face with its early gray and its long-buried hope coming back into it, slow as the sun coming over the ridge, and she gave him the only answer there had ever been in her to give, the answer she had been walking 400 miles and 28 years toward without once letting herself believe she would arrive. "I'd already decided to," she said. "I decided the first night in the spring house when I set my mother's churn on the shelf. I'd just been waiting on you to catch up." And the laugh that broke out of Caleb Halverson then was a cracked, rusty, unpracticed thing, a sound that place had not heard out of him in a year and more, and Toby's head came up sharp from the paddock at the strangeness and the wonder of it. And old Asa by the post turned his face away and made a great business of his pipe, so no one would see. And the goats grumbled, and the spring house hummed, and the frost burned slowly off the long grass in the climbing gold light. She had walked into a panicked, half-wild billy goat in the Drum Hollow depot yard. That was how it had started. A maddened beast loose and smashing crates, while every man in the county stood back, every man but her, and the whole country had bet against her then, the fat milk woman come off the stage with one flour sack to her name, too much of everything to be of any use to anyone. She had gentled the goat with a low voice and a sure hand, while the yard gawked. She had been gentling the whole hard place ever since, the goats and the boy and the old man and the soured cow and the caved-in spring-house and the grief-shut man, with that same low voice and that same sure hand, asking nothing, letting the work answer. And now she stood in the gold frost light of the Antler Bend road, chosen by every single one of them. Chosen by Toby, who had beaten the frost to bring her the last berries of the year. Chosen by old Asa, who told his bold kind lies about the iron he'd always known was in her. Chosen by the land itself, the spring house humming, the wheels curing, the standing contract that would carry the place through this winter and the next and all the long winters after. And chosen by Caleb, who had only ever needed the goats milked, and had got instead a whole life back from the woman the county threw away. They were married before the snows came in earnest, in Hattie Sells's front parlor with the storekeeper beaming and Mr. Renfrew sending up a wheel of the very cheese as a wedding gift, and old Asa standing up beside Caleb in a collar that near choked him and Toby, holding the ring on a length of paddock twine. Mordecai Quill was long gone by then, his doctored scales and his cooked tally books his ruin. His side word with the banker Eustace Vane turned to ash the day the honest way tickets and Lemuel Pike's signed account came out on the counter. The man had sold up cheap and left Drum Hollow on the down stage and was not spoken of again, except as a caution. The town that had sneered at the fat milk woman lined up now at Hattie's counter for her wheels, and called her Mrs. Halverson, and meant it with respect. The contempt flipped clean over the way a coin flips, the whole of Drum Hollow tasting at last what it had been too small to see. The spring house never went quiet again. It hummed through that winter and through the spring kidding and through the long gold summers after, wheel on wheel on wheel, the cheese coin clearing the note clean to the last dollar and then building, slow and honest, a thing none of them had dared hope for, a future. Toby grew up at her elbow in the curing room and learned to read bloom and weather and beast the way she read them, and stood a head taller than her one day and still trailed her with his running account of the goats. Caleb's grief did not vanish, for grief never does, but it made room, year on year, for the new warm thing that had come to live in the house, and he learned again how to laugh that rusty, cracked laugh until it was rusty no longer. And Orpher Brand, who had come off the stage with a flour sack holding a dented copper churn and a wooden cheese hoop and nothing else in all the wide world, who had been told her whole life she was too much of everything and had answered every time by letting the patient labor of her two strong hands speak for her. Orpher Brand stood on the ridge above the humming spring house on 100 frost, bright mornings after, and 1,000, with the gold light flooding up the Antler Bend road, and the goats coming grumbling down the willow slope, and the boy running ahead, and the man's even tread coming up behind her. And she was never, for one single day of the rest of her long and well-loved life, alone.